Hi, my name is Austin Keller, and I want to go over some of the schema that are in the counterpoint etude I wrote. So the first schema that really starts it off is an opening gambit. It's something that starts a piece and starts moving it forward. It's like an opening phrase or initiating phrase. The one I picked is a tied bass. So there's two different types of tied bass. One is a tied bass that comes back to where it started. So if we're in E minor, which this piece is in, it will start on E, go down a half step, and then come back. So we get. Now on the guitar, whenever we do tied basses, because it doesn't hold like an organ, we have to re-strike the notes. So if this piece is in 2, so that means for the first measure, we're going to get 1, there's the tie, and back. So with that tied bass, that means the intervals we're going to need is, to begin with, some sort of 5/3 chord, which then moves to a 4/2 chord. There's a couple different ways to do it. One, we could just have straight 4/2, or we can have a 6/4/2. So because we're in minor, we're going to get a minor 6 there. Now that 6th here is going to have to move down with the bass to another 6. So we get 6/4/2 going to a 6/5 and back. There's a couple, and the other way to do it is if we have 5 like that. When we move to here with the 6 chord, the 6 can move down to a 5 and then a 3 when the bass comes back. Sol, sol, fa, mi, sol, fa, mi. Well, in that case, sorry, we'd have to keep it. Now, the other thing we can do is incorporate a do, re, mi into this melody. So in this case, and that's what I opted to do here. So we can think of a simple do, re, mi would just be octave, moving to tenths, and then it moves up. So we can think of rule the octave, the first bit. Scale degree 1 in rule the octave, moves down to scale degree 7 in rule the octave. So with the tied bass, what we'll do instead is, instead of just moving all the voices together, we'll offset the bass. Or now when we add diminutions like what I have here is, I opted for a kind of a reaching over pattern. So it starts, so each little bit kind of overshoots it and then comes back down. And we work our way up like that. Now with the guitar, you'll notice when we reach that up here, that's a really uncomfortable stretch. So we can't play it down here. So you'll find that often we have to move things around on the fretboard to accommodate stretches like that. So in this case, we have to move it up here where we have open strings available, but where we can easily move to this instead of that. So what we do instead is just do a shift when we move on, rather than having to deal with a big stretch. So we shift once to get it over the way with, rather than having to deal with an uncomfortable stretch that builds tension in our hands. These patterns, you kind of have to learn which one fits where, but in this case, you see it quite often in some of the guitar music where it's up here rather than down here for that exact reason. That chord is too much of a stretch. So now when we look at the continuation, what we can get with the tied bass is it has a continuation built into it, meaning that the pattern we put on top can now go on the bottom, and that'll be the second part of the phrase, opening phrase. So in this one, we have, I'll start it off here. That could be a little tricky, but that. Now once we reach down here, the bass picks up the melody. Now what you'll notice is that we end, because it's a do, re, mi, we end up on scale degree 3 on the top. But with the pattern, we want scale degree 1 for the tied bass. So what's going to happen is they'll overlap a little bit. So the ending of the first phrase here will end with 3 on the top, but then just on the next available moment, it moves down. Same here, we have scale degree 3 in the bottom, but then it moves back here. So because they're invertible, what you'll see is that when it's on top and the tied bass is on the bottom, we get the 2 moving to a 3. So intervals between the bass and the melody. Octave, 2, 3, 3. When it's on the bottom, it's going to be octave, 7, 6, 6 instead. So the second inverts to the 7th, thirds invert to 6th. Now, it's when we swap them, we get this effect. So we repeat it twice and get a nice opening phrase. The second time I do this is in A minor. That one we can fit down lower. Now that one, because I then want to move off into new material, I don't repeat it in the bottom, but we can just as easily invert it and have the same kind of full initiation, continuation that we had at the beginning. Oops. So the other pattern I have is a descending fifth sequence. In the Parlamento literature, they call it ascending by fourths, descending by fifths. They're fairly similar. It's just different terminology. So on this one, the first one I have is alternating, where it's imitative. The top voice and the bottom voice, they alternate. So it relies on the same pattern that gets repeated. The pattern is, and then so once that's done, oops, the bottom voice does it. So they snake back and forth. And so forth. Now what you'll notice is because they alternate, the top voice and the bottom voice, if you kind of look at them isolated, they only move down by step. So it's like a module that moves down by step. Even though the harmony is moving. So that pattern there is quite keyboard centric. The voices jumping and moving around involves a lot of shifting. It's hard to maintain the independence of the voices. That one's probably quite easy on keyboard, but on the guitar it's quite difficult. So I included a second one to kind of show hard version, what's possible versus an easier, more guitaristic version. So the second one relies on movement across the guitar this way, so more static voices that repeat with arpeggiation underneath, rather than this jumping long melodic line. So the second one is similar, except for we're in A minor. So the bass pattern is the same, but the chords are a little different. So in the first one, we can think of all those, even though they're single notes, we can think of it as a bunch of series of 5/3 chords. The second one here is a bunch of 7th chords. So when we have, when you start one of these sequences, the thirds become the 7ths of the next voice. And then on the top voice there, so when you put them together, so we always have a 7th active, and we always have a 10th in the voice. So they change which one is doing which. Now, to fill it out, you add an extra stationary voice. So the first time it's an octave, second time it's a 5th, octave, 5th, then octave. So if we look at that, I'll highlight the inner voice. So now I'll play the pattern. Now you'll notice that it gives the illusion of 3 voices. First one, so the voice ends here, and then new voice, new voice, so we have the one on top, da da da, and ba da da dum, da da dum, da da dum, moving underneath it. So those are the 2 sequences I have. They're same in nature, but a little different in presentation. So now the next sequence I have is a little bit later. It's a variant of that. It's down by thirds, ascending by step. So we just finished cadencing in E minor, and I use this to move to the dominant. So usually with sequences, you want at least 3 modules or 3 segments. So in this case, I'm gonna target B, then A, and then finish in G, because I want to move to G major. So the first one, I tonicize that B, so I can always have this semitone motion in the bass. Before landing on G and finishing. So I get this. So the part that moves on there is a little bit more melodic, or more like an aria rather than this strict fugal writing. And it's mostly rule of the octave. So if we think of this in rule of the octave terms, and scale degree 1, 5/3, but then I have third in the top. Without moving the third on the top, the bottom voice moves up to scale degree 3. So if we think of the intervals that would be below, it would be 5/3, and then 6/3 chord. So if we just do maybe really octave there, it would be moving up to scale degree 4 with 6 chord, and then another 6 chord. But in this case, I want to add a suspension for some melodic, to make the melody a little bit more expressive. So when I move up to scale degree 4, I want to keep that. And then it resolves there. And then continues on downwards. Scale degree 5, and I have compound cadence, so it's 6/4 chord. Now what I do here is, because I want to repeat it again for dramatic effect, I do what's called an invaded cadence. That's where, instead of just cadencing, you move off either That's a deceptive cadence, but it's really similar. You don't land where you think the audience thinks you're going to land. You move to some sort of other thing. So you can also basically move to a 6 chord instead of the 5/3 chord. So instead of, you can go and then start it again. I basically do that here, where I move down to scale degree 4. So suddenly that what should be a 5/3 chord, just our dominant chord, becomes a, if we're thinking really octave, sharp 4/2, this kind of harmony. So it destabilizes it, and we land on a weaker 6 chord. So that's not strong enough to be an authentic cadence. But that's okay, because what it does is it sets up the motion to do it again. So now when I repeat it, for melodic interest, I vary the melody a little bit, mostly rhythmically. So instead of it being, I do triplets. So on the first one, I'd go D, G, B, but because I have to add an extra note, I start a little bit lower in the chord. I start on a B instead of a D. Because I have to fit in an extra note. So then when we get here, it's still this that sort of pattern, but I do triplets again, and I just have to repeat a note. And then now last thing is when the register makes it think I want to go like this. Which works fine, but because I want to immediately jump into something new, if I cadence down here, I'm going to be constricted in range. So as soon as you kind of have your melody note on these bottom 4 strings, if you add more than 2 voices, it can get quite compressed and you don't have much room because you run out of range on the instrument. So often what you can do is jump the register, and so instead of that, it's, you see that quite a bit. It's not pure in terms of voice leading, I guess, but it's one of the compromises we just have to make on the instrument. So following that, we move into, we have a couple patterns that are related. It's going to be a Monte, and then I'm not sure what the exact term for this other one is. It might be a kind of like a minor Monte. So the Monte, as we know, is scale degree 3, moving up to scale degree 6, chromatically, or through a series of 5/6 motions. The minor version starts on scale degree 5 and moves up to scale degree 1, chromatically still. But, so depending kind of what I guess you considered your key center, they really would be quite similar. So if I was in C, and I ended here, that would be just the Monte. But if I'm in A minor and I end there, the other version, so they're really similar, but the context kind of changes how they sound. So I'll start with the major mode one first. So let's finish this right off that melodic part. I use that to bring us back to E minor. So we're in G major, and now we'll come back to E minor. So it's a way to move to the minor mode. In this case, there's 2 different segments you can think of. When you have a 6 chord, it's this sort of, we have Mi, Fa on the bottom, or 7/1 in the bottom, and then 4/3 in the top, or Fa, Mi. So Mi, Fa against Fa, Mi. Get that sort of motion. So we have, how do I do? Shoot, sorry. I don't have the sheet music in front of me. land on the 5/3 chord, we get this little that sort of B-da-da chromatic lower neighbor. I prolong to kind of confirm the new key with this alternation between 1 and 7. And I use a Durante diminution pattern. That's for embellishing that stepwise motion. It's from the 5th Partimenti, the diminuti. That one, it's the major and minor. I have another video where you can look at that. Now the minor version, I have 2 separate instances of it. So the first one's quicker. It doesn't take very long. It's quite condensed. This is when we're in A minor. So what I do here is I move to a deceptive cadence. So instead of going, I move to scale degree 6. Now, this minor pattern, we start on 5 with a raised 3rd, so it's going to be your dominant chord, and it moves to, often what you have is you have an octave, so it works really well, especially if when you land on a half cadence, following a half cadence, where you have the octaves between the lower voices and the top voice, is when the bottom voice moves up by step, we get a 7th that then resolves to a 6th. And then when we get chromatic note, so here, that can move down, and then we get the same thing. So the pattern, if we're going to call it the intervals, are 5/3, and then 7, 6, 6/5, 5/3, 6/5, 5/3. So the first one, I add suspensions. So I have a series of 9/8 suspensions. So this comes from the 6/5 chord. It's between the 10th. So with the 10th, if the bass moves up by step, we get a 9th. So we get this every time I have that. That pattern. Those are quite difficult to do on the guitar, so you have to kind of use them wisely. Then same as here, 10th between the G sharp and the B. Now what you could do to make that a little easier is just imply that suspension. So you break it up. They won't sound, but you kind of imply it. If you had an organ and you played it like that, they still would sound. So you can kind of make an illusion like that on the guitar. It's probably more idiomatic. I didn't choose it because I kind of wanted to keep that, wanted to have that roughness. And then, now the thing with this one and the next one we're going to look at is how I use this to bring back to a new key to kind of modulate. So I learned this from the Figetta by Giuliani. Is he has a Monte where he does it, so this could work with a Monte as well. So once he reaches that 5/3 chord on the 6, you move up, almost like you're doing that, setting up one of those motions. So 5, 6, but then you come back down, and then you tie the bass to a 4/2 chord. So it's a way to move. Can I do this in my head? We're in A and we're moving to E, so you're moving up a 5th or you're moving down a 4th. It's a way to move like that. So and in my case, I do this. moves us to the double cadence. But it's the same idea. It's a tied bass with the sharp 4. We'll talk about that version of the tied bass in a second near the end. Now the next time I use that pattern, it's in near the end. It's the same idea where we're kind of reaching, we have we're in A minor both times, and we're on the dominant chord. In this case, we reach a half cadence. So we have reach this firm half cadence. Now, the other one was quick, where the harmonic rhythm moved quite quickly. This one I stretch it out for dramatic effect. And so it gives a little more flexibility in how the two voices interact. So on this one we have here, with the 5-3, then I re-articulate the top to remind us of that top voice, to get it back in our ear for the suspension. So we have the 7th resolving to the 6th, and then the bass moves up chromatically. And then there's the 4th suspension, and then the same thing. And then here's again the tied bass. And then it's I follow it up with something really similar, except for I stretch it out because the rising pattern before was also stretched out. So the last thing I'll say about that is that the last two segments are really similar to the last two modules of Monte, where you have this 6-5-1, 6-5. Once you say a bunch of intervals, it gets a little muddy. 6-5-5-3, 6-5-5-3. You know, it's this sound where it repeats. Imitates one step higher, you know. Now, the last thing I'll say is about the tied bass section at the end. So, like I mentioned at the beginning, that's the motive that starts us off, is a tied bass that moves back to where it came from. Now, the other variant is one that continues downward. When we do that, instead of having what's called a minor fourth, but which is really a perfect fourth. So that's, hear how that wants to resolve back. We need a augmented fourth, or a major fourth. That's gonna move the voices, instead of coming back together, they're going to move it away. Where we're kind of moving outwards. So in this case, we're going to need each one of these, you can do these without having to change key at all, but in this one, or use notes outside of the key. However, in this one, I'm going to use notes that kind of tonicize the next one. You could think of this with inversions, I guess, if you want, but in terms of bass notes, like where you're thinking of implied bass, F sharp going to B, and then so forth, kind of down circle of fifths. It's a whole nother topic we could talk about, is the relationship between this tied bass and then the various sequential motions, but I don't want to get into that. So in this, what we're going to need is a 2, sharp 6, and sharp 4. So we get, and that's going to resolve to 6 chord. Same thing here. Here's our sharp 4. Then here, this is naturally in the key. Our sharp 4 there, or F natural. I'm sorry, F sharp. Going to 6 chord. So I do 3 versions. Once I get here, I want to stay at G, or I want to kind of commit to this key, so I really octave down. So So I use that to get out of it. But the pattern is, that's going to be... to get out. Okay. So those are the main sequences that I used for the piece. Those are the main schemas. So lots of different ways to do it. This was more of a challenge to see if I know how to use them. Let me know what you think of it, and let me know if you have any suggestions for approval, or if you want to see, some, or with an explainer. This is my first time doing explainer, so if you want to, there's some things I missed that you want me to cover a little bit more, or parts that maybe I spent too much time on. So just some comments for improvement. Anyways, thanks for listening. Bye.